Hello and welcome to part 2 of the story of Catherine the Great. If you missed part 1, don't worry, the link should be in the description so you can go and watch that. However, I will drop a little quick recap for you right now. Okay, so there was a girl called Sophia. Her mum was quite mean. Anyways, the Empress of Russia wanted her to marry her nephew, who was also Sophia's cousin. They hated one another, and most likely, none of the kids were his. Now he's emperor, he's pulled out a war in Prussia and trying to start one with Denmark. But there are moments in history where fates are sealed and time shifts in a new direction. This is the story of Catherine's rise to power and her initial rule. Okay, long video, so we'll keep this bit short as well. I have a Patreon, regular updates, sneak peeks, early access to videos. I have a book on Amazon, also on merch, so if you want, you can check those out. Now on with the video. So, as we left off, there was a coup beginning to form around the Emperor as his attention was dragged away from the capital and towards his war with Denmark. Now, as we quickly glanced over in part 1, Catherine had a lover called Grigory Orlov. The pair now led the conspiracy to depose the incompetent emperor. However, the universe realised I would make this video just after the Pyrrhus two-parter and decided to throw in a little bit of Pyrrhic luck. This would have been fine had the other guard been in on the plot. So, the original guard and a guard officer central to the plot were quickly arrested. So, on the 8th of July 1762, Grigory Orlov initiated the coup against Peter as the co-conspirators met in a panic. Panin, who in the future would become one of Catherine's highest officials, calmed his co-conspirators, urging them to act hastily, otherwise jail or even worse awaited them. With this, Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, was quickly dispatched to Peterhof Palace, just outside of St. Petersburg, where Catherine was currently staying. As Alexei left the Winter Palace, he grabbed the first carriage he could find, bribing the driver to show Russia the meaning of haste. At the time, Peter, who was tired from playing with toy soldiers, was asleep in Oranienbaum. That's not how you pronounce it, but that's what I'm going with. A small outpost also just outside St. Petersburg, although a little in the other direction to Peterhof. Once he woke up, he began observing one of his regiments. He then planned to move on to his military campaign in Denmark, after maybe having a party or two. At 5 a.m, the Empress Consort is awoken by Alexei, who simply tells her the time has come. Execute Order 666. Except he doesn't say the last part. Alexei quickly explains the situation as Catherine gets dressed in the bare minimum and the pair then race for the carriage. However, the horses are understandably tired from their recent charge from the Winter Palace to Peterhof and so refuse to go at full gallop. By pure coincidence, a farm wagon pulls up alongside the would-be usurper. Coins are exchanged, and soon 2 strong farm horses are charging towards St. Petersburg. News does reach Peter that there is a conspiracy against him. However, he is far more concerned with making his contingent from Holstein parade before him, so he simply shrugs off the information. Catherine reaches St. Petersburg and begins the process of travelling to each guard unit stationed there. One by one, they all swear fealty. Meanwhile, Peter is now playing violin in his room when he is rudely interrupted by a messenger from St. Petersburg. Annoyed with the interruption, Peter simply commands the poor guy who was tasked with delivering the message to leave it on the table and he'll read it later. He never does.
Foreshadowing.
Catherine has now built herself a minor army made up of an entourage of guards. On the other hand, Peter orders a caravan to take him back to Peterhof. He's in such a rush to get back and have a lavish feast that he forgets his normal cavalry escort. Bold move. Well, let's see how this one plays out. Afternoon sees Catherine march on the Winter Palace, where she meets with the Senate and the Holy Synod, the largest religious council in Russia. She tells them that it is her love of Russia and the Orthodox faith that have forced her to act against her husband. Catherine then declares that she only took the throne at the behest of her subjects from an emperor who endangered them. Catherine goes on to speak about how she'd been forced to take on such severe actions to protect Russia from foreign power and foreign religion. Which is ironic because she is a foreigner who came to Russia with a foreign religion. Finally, back at Peterhof, Peter and the partygoers arrive to discover the palace empty. Peter quickly descends into a fit of rage and storms about the palace looking for Catherine. "Did I not tell you she was capable of anything?" Peter screamed at a member of his entourage. It's not like they'd been trying to tell him that for the entire day. Some of the more senior revellers quickly offered their helping hand to go to St. Petersburg and find Catherine and get this all straightened out. I'm sure none of them were thinking how close the border was. As evening begins to beat back the day, an embassy from Peter arrives at the Winter Palace and pleads with Catherine not to take up arms against Peter. Catherine simply smiles and takes the head of the party to the balcony where there is a large crowd of people screaming her name. She then simply states, "Deliver your message to them." The entire embassy then immediately swore fealty to Catherine on the spot, although some just asked to retire. The crew of the firework barge sailing to Peterhof with fireworks for Peter's party gave vague information about the coup, although they themselves knew barely anything as they had left early in the morning. Now an absolutely livid Peter sends for his Holstein regiment in Arienbaum. The enraged emperor screams that he will defend himself to the death. Sounds like a very unsuccessful defence if it's reaching that point. His men soon arrive and Peter stations them along the road to the capital. However, he forgot one key detail. No one bothered to tell the Holstein regiment that they were expecting a scrap. So they were all stationed with wooden parade ground rifles. His advisors hurriedly found him a Russian uniform because he was still wearing his Prussian one. Their aim was for him to ride as hard as he could to the Winter Palace and remind his people who their emperor was. Not all of his advisors agree on this though. Another advises him to meet up with a contingent 70 miles away and then march on the Winter Palace with an actual fighting force. A third advisor simply tells Peter to flee to Germany. And at this point, all is not lost. Peter could take any of these options. Peter instead goes for option D and does absolutely nothing. He does send a few men to an island fortress to secure it, but it turns out to still be loyal. Foreshadowing. Meanwhile, Catherine now had the support of the Senate, the Synod, the army, and the people. All she needed was for Peter to formally abdicate. Catherine then took on the rank of colonel of the Preobrazhensky Guards, as was her right as Russia's sovereign. That's definitely not how you pronounce that. Catherine borrowed pieces of uniform from any man that looked about her size. Once she had a complete uniform and looked somewhat presentable, she marched outside to greet her new soldiers dressed as one of them. Catherine proudly led the march towards Peter, but as her guards marched behind her, a young subaltern rushed forward to give her his sword knot. This was the only piece of uniform she lacked, and the young subaltern's name was Grigory Potemkin. We'll come back to him in part 3. Peter now realised that the timer had run out and his last save point was before he was born, so he decided to withdraw to the island fortress he secured earlier. However, once he got there, he found its harbour closed to him. Confused and angry, Peter shouted out, "Do you not know me? I am your emperor!" The reply he received back was, "We no longer have an emperor. Long live Empress Catherine II. Although I personally disagree with the historians' translations, I think it probably went more along the lines of "get f***." You see, while Peter had been busy sulking, the top admiral of the navy had sworn fealty to Catherine. He had then travelled to the island to take over his command personally. Realising he was defeated, Peter retreated to his cabin on his boat. Once back at Peterhof, he rushed to his room and began writing a letter to Catherine. In the letter, Peter apologised for his behaviour and offered to share the throne with Catherine. My guy really following the pattern of every toxic ex in history. As the second day dawns, Catherine receives Peter's letter. She barely reacts to it and instead decides to wait. Shortly after, she receives another letter from Peter, this time offering to abdicate the throne as long as he's allowed to return to Holstein. Catherine accepts his terms, and Peter writes an abdication statement detailing why and how he is unfit to rule. Upon his abdication, Peter was immediately taken prisoner on the 9th of July 1762. And even though Catherine had accepted Peter's terms, he would never see Holstein again, instead being transferred to Rochba Palace just outside of St. Petersburg. Everything is just outside of St. Petersburg. Catherine would be declared Empress Catherine II on the same day. Frederick the Great, the man Peter looked up to more than any other, simply stated that he had allowed himself to be dethroned like a child being sent to bed. Mysteriously, on the 17th of July of the same year, Peter was found dead, either from hemorrhoids or strangulation, possibly on the orders of Grigory Orlov. Catherine, however, had absolutely nothing to do with the murder of her abusive and childlike ex-husband. She did, however, then pardon his killers. Now, some people do still argue the hemorrhoids theory, and I say, why not both? Just imagine him being strangled with his own hemorrhoids. I really hope that you're all eating your favourite dinner right now. Historians still actually do debate her part in the passing of Peter III, although it would make sense as his removal would lower any chances of counter-rebellions in his name. On the 22nd of September 1762, Catherine was officially crowned as the Empress of Russia, and she had a lavish ceremony in the Kremlin. A new crown was made from 70 pearls and 5,000 Indian diamonds. These covered two spherical lobes which represented the West and Eastern Roman empires. This symbolism is, you guessed it, foreshadowing. In the centre of the crown was a large ruby, underneath a diamond-encrusted Orthodox cross. This would become known as the Russian Imperial Crown. The really good news is the crown actually survived the revolution in Russia, so you can still see it in the Kremlin armoury today. If you're watching this when I uploaded the video, I wouldn't recommend going right now. Maybe leave it a little bit. In 1764, it was discovered that there was a plot to release Ivan VI. This plot obviously went nowhere, and Ivan was mildly unalived. As you can see, Catherine's legitimacy to rule was questioned, and in fact it's still discussed and debated to this day. In fact, in the 1770s, there was even rumours of a coup to place her son on the throne instead. Once in power, Catherine immediately reversed all of Peter's policies. This was done with such speed that riders were able to catch up with Russian forces literally just about to march into Denmark. This then marked a new era of Russian neutrality, and Catherine would take no further sides in the 7 Years' War. This, understandably, boosted her opinion with the military greatly. However, things weren't as straightforward when it came to dealing with the Orthodox Church. Catherine paused Peter's orders to secularise church land, but she had an issue. The Russian Empire was breaking at the seams. For a start, the price of grain had skyrocketed, and the treasury wasn't exactly full of treasure. This was because Peter hadn't pushed for total victory over Prussia, which meant that the money sunk into the war effort saw no returns via the means of reparations. There was, however, a solution to Russia's money problems. 1/10 of the empire's wealth was tied up in church land. Catherine spoke with the synod at length and said that how could a church that didn't help with the charity of education speak at all on morality? Being Catherine, she also threw in a few thinly veiled threats in there just for good measure. Reluctantly, the church agreed, and all church property belonged to the state. Overnight, over 1 million church serfs became tax-paying peasants, whilst church officials were now employees of the state. Catherine's next issue was the serfs, because in Russia, the serfs were slaves. These people were bought, sold, gambled away, and forced to work for their master. Many serfs often found themselves employed in the Urals by mining enterprises. The lives of these people were often horrific and short, and many of them found themselves worked to death. So the young and idealistic Catherine set out to reform this new empire she had usurped. Who knows? Maybe she can prevent up against the wall, comrade, for another century or two. Other than preparing sweeping reforms inside Imperial Russia, Catherine got busy placing her ex-lover Stanislav August Pontinovsky on the throne of Poland. She even got a cute little pen pal. Maybe you've heard of him. It was called Voltaire. Now that she could put all of these reforms in place, Catherine wrote the Nakaz. The Nakaz was simply a series of guidelines on how to make laws. To help her make these urgently needed changes to Russian legislature, Catherine came up with a revolutionary idea. She brought in people from every region and religion of Russia to be her representatives. Once assembled, they would discuss the problems that they faced. Of course, only the free classes could attend. This meeting was an incredibly diverse collection of people, including Cossacks, Muslims and Buddhists. In fact, it allowed 10% of Russia's population to cast their state in the case. Wait, that can't be right. Yes, that is right. 90% of Russia's population were serfs. Even of those who did attend, some of them just believed it was a loyalty test and elected to just agree with whatever Catherine said. The others had absolutely no idea what to put forward, and this led to the first topic of discussion being, what should Catherine's honorific be? One of the titles that they nearly decided on was the All-Wise Mother of the Fatherland. Luckily for historians, authors and social media content creators, they went with the Great. Now obviously Catherine had invited them to discuss, well, reforms, but most of them couldn't read, and the ones who couldn't decipher the enlightened intellectualism of the Nakaz. This led to everyone in attendance basically just guessing what they were doing. Now, like all the best pieces of literature, the Nakaz was banned, specifically in France, where they wanted to avoid any revolutions. This, to this day, is why there's no revolution jokes made about France. All jokes aside, though, it just shows that any information that is banned is done so for your best interests. Eventually, however, as the debates actually got going, it turned out that the merchants just wanted the rights of the nobles just wanted the rights of the merchants, and it's just good to see that politics hasn't changed in the last few hundred years. Catherine did have smaller problems to deal with, though, as the peasants that showed up just simply moaned about their neighbours. Now, as forward-thinking as Catherine was, she wasn't about to establish a democracy. She was still an absolutist or an absolute monarchist. What she would do was ask her subjects what they wanted her to do with her power. Catherine would eventually give up on the debates and move her focus to foreign affairs. In fact, in 1766, Catherine organised a trade agreement with the British Empire, stopping just short of a full-blown alliance as she didn't want to upset the other European powers. Her next move was to lay claim to the Azov region around Crimea. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Catherine's ex-lover, puppet king of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, had finally pushed his people too far, and they began to rebel. The Russian army was then sent in to deal with the Polish rebellion, and ended up chasing the rebels over the Polish border, into the territory of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans then took this opportunity to join the war at the behest of the French. This sparked the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774. The Ottomans quickly found themselves up against a Russian army that was far more advanced than they had expected, and one of the commanders was Grigory Potemkin. Part 3, don't worry, we'll get to it. The Ottomans did have one thing going for them though: naval supremacy in the Black Sea. However, the Russians just got around this by sailing their Baltic fleet around Europe and into the Black Sea. Here they met the Ottomans at the Battle of Chesna, which raged from the 5th to the 7th of July 1770. This saw the Ottoman navy completely obliterated. The Ottomans' run of bad luck continued as they fought in one of the largest land battles of the 18th century. On the 21st of July 1770, the Russians' 40,000 men came up against the Ottomans and the Crimean Khanate at the Battle of Kagul. The Ottoman and Crimean forces had around 50,000 infantry and between 80,000 and 100,000 cavalry. However, despite their numerical advantage, the battle ended in a horrific defeat for the Ottomans, with around 20,000 men unalived. This led to the Treaty of... I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, but it gave Russia large swaths of land in Eastern Europe as well as in the Caucasus. The treaty also gave independence to the Khanate of Crimea. This independence was guaranteed by Catherine and the Russian Empire. Gee, at least we know nothing is going to happen to the independence of Crimea. Foreshadowing. For a lot of recent history, actually. The Russian economy also got a well-needed boost in the form of war reparations. Imperial Russia also found itself the protector of Orthodox Christians living within the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans weren't the only enemies of the Russian Empire, however, and if you remember from earlier in this video, that conflict was an offshoot of Russian intervention in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The declining power sat in the middle of Prussia, Russia, and Austria. The failing state no longer had any real means to defend itself. The days of the mighty winged hussars had arrived and left. And now Poland stood as the answer to Frederick the Great's problems. You see, Frederick hated the Polish, and while this is an oddity for a German leader, it is said that this influenced his decision to lead the first partition of Poland. You see, Frederick and Catherine had a sort of secret alliance. If one was engaged with another power, the other one would only have to provide financial support. Yet the Prussians' main rival and fellow Germanic people, the Austrians, began to fear Russia's domination over the Turks, eventually weighing in joining the war on the side of the Ottomans. This would kick in the second portion of the alliance, and Frederick would be forced to join the war on the side of Russia. Not really wanting to get involved in a war that could quite quickly snowball and engulf all of Europe, Frederick proposed that instead of taking a bite out of the Ottomans, why don't they just take a slice of the juicy cake that was the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth and divide it between the Central and Eastern European powers. This also meant that the Ottomans owed him. The first partition of Poland saw the northwestern territories ceded to Prussia and the southwestern territories ceded to Austria. Finally, a chunk of eastern Poland was ceded to Russia. Obviously, Catherine's puppet king ratified this, and it came to pass that large chunks of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's territory was ceded without a fight. The first partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth happened in 1772, and sadly, there would be two more partitions within Catherine's reign. The first partition saw a massive increase in the Jewish population within the Russian Empire, and for the most part, the Jewish people were just left to do their own thing. However, Catherine would go on to ban them from the middle class in 1790. Catherine began to restrict teachings of Christianity in schools and even seized or closed down churches and monasteries. She also prevented clergymen from having any say in Russian affairs. I must say, if you want to learn more about the partitions of Poland, check out the end of my Siege of Vienna video where I briefly discuss them. Now, for understandable reasons, the serfs rebelled between 1773 and 1775. This became known as the Pugachev Rebellion after its leader, Yemelin Pugachev. Originally only considered a minor revolt, it had already obliterated the two forces Catherine had sent to deal with it. The commander of the second force actually had his head removed, which I can't imagine he was too happy with because I'm guessing he was still using it. However, this small group of serfs and Cossacks quickly grew to Russia's largest ever peasant revolt. The reasons for the revolt varied. One being the horrific conditions that the serfs suffered under had finally reached boiling point. Old leaders of the Orthodox hierarchy had become disgruntled with some of Catherine's reforms to the Orthodox Church. And lastly, government officials and tax collectors meddling with Cossack affairs and raising taxes had also caused tensions to boil over. To gain some legitimacy, Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, who had survived his assassination attempt and escaped to the far corners of the empire. He then rallied this new rebel force by telling them that the reason he was deposed was because he planned to end serfdom. Pugachev then offered religious freedoms for the Cossacks, which they liked, and exemption from taxation, which they loved. This rebellion actually ended up controlling large portions of Russia. That was until the Russian army returned from Ottoman territory. As you can imagine, it's Russian history. Catherine simply sent an overwhelming force to obliterate the revolt. These overwhelming numbers of Russian forces quickly put down the rebellion, and Catherine was able to once again focus on her plans for reform. And we'll take a look at those in part 3. See you in the next one. Bye.